Hey everyone, I wanted to go ahead and discuss some of the exciting news that we ended up coming across regarding a developer interview that the Kiwi Talks podcast had with Paul Tazur, one of the retro developers, when they decided to provide some more interesting information regarding the development woes and issues that they had with Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Prime 3, as well as Project X. This was a canceled Nintendo project essentially from Rare, where they were really working hard to try to kind of solidify themselves as a studio, and it just simply never made its way out. So first and foremost, I want to give a quick shout out to Kiwi Talks, the podcast. I think they're doing a fantastic job. I'm going to leave a link in the description below for their official interview. I think they did a great job on it. They got a lot of really interesting information that we're going to be going over in just a bit. And also, of course, to Paul Tazur, a previous retro developer, essentially who no longer works there, of course, but went ahead and actually spoke about things that aren't necessarily too positively seen by Nintendo whenever information like this gets out. They're usually very secretive about, production and development details, and they just don't want people to talk about these kind of things. So some of the major takeaways that we actually got from this specific interview is that they mentioned that nearly every boss battle that Retro completed, when it was actually sent to Nintendo would actually go ahead and change it. Essentially, the higher ups at Nintendo just basically wanted the game to be in one way, and Retro just kept making something else. So they kept having to rework the game. So we're talking about Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Prime 3. They mentioned specifically that the final battle with Dark Samus at the end of Metroid Prime 2 had to be remade twice over. Can you imagine the amount of developer work you have to put when essentially Nintendo keeps telling you to change it because they're not too happy with it? It's just crazy. They also mentioned that Kensube Tanabe, one of the original designers and producers for the Metroid Prime series, basically wanted dozens of Dark Samuses flying around at the end of that specific battle in Metroid Prime 2, but due to the performance issues, they basically had to scrap that idea. You can actually imagine that actually happening, since development woes happen usually when consoles are not necessarily at the peak. This is something that I've been covering a lot when it comes to Monster Hunter Rise on the Nintendo Switch, and I've covered a lot of developer interviews, and they mentioned that performance, they just have had to scrap ideas simply because they just cannot get it to work properly. They also mentioned that Retro would show Nintendo what they were working on, and Nintendo would basically request major changes. Kind of like with the previous two mentions with Prime 2 and Prime 3. Essentially, Nintendo just didn't want to give Retro the right to be able to do whatever it is that they wanted to do. They basically just kept telling them to do what Nintendo wanted them to do. Again, Retro is located, I believe, here in North America, in the US. Nintendo's a Japanese company. You can kind of understand why these things were originally, back in those days, a little bit more complex. They also mentioned that a number of retro developers were Halo fans. Remember that Halo was all the craze around that time period when Metroid Prime 2 and 3 were being released, which led to influencing of Metroid Prime 3. So essentially you can see that, of course, this is something that happens often quite a days now, where you see developers working on a game that is similar to something that already recently came out, and they decide to just add some of those ideas into a game. So this doesn't necessarily surprise me all that much, but it's interesting to see it confirmed in this way. They also mentioned that the developers will butt heads with Tanabe, as he didn't necessarily care about Halo, which again is just the traditional Japanese mentality, I guess. It's just not necessarily pay too much attention to the West. What they are doing, we are doing our very own thing, and to this day you can still see a lot of those developmental ideas produce some interesting games from Japanese audiences, but not necessarily go over too well here in the West. The last couple of things that they do mention is that the first two Metroid Prime boss battles with Dark Samus were Retro's attempt to make a boss encounter similarly typical to the Western first-person shooter. And actually, this is something that you can see clear in when you actually go over some of the gameplay, and you can see just how interesting they were trying to tweak that game and make it into a more appealing package for the Western audience. Now, a lot of people would say that Metroid Prime 3 didn't necessarily nail it all. Probably the first one was better received, but I think all three games are pretty good. And of course, the last thing that they do mention, of course, is that Project X was meant to show that Nintendo that they didn't need their oversight, essentially, but Retro Studios eventually canceled this project. So I guess that's just kind of like the capping to this entire thing, where Retro tries something, Nintendo says, no, we want you to do it that way. And then Retro tries again, and Nintendo's like, well, what about this? And it's just basically Project S was one of those ideas where, Retro wanted to solidify themselves as a studio, and Nintendo just kept giving them grief over it, which, again, I think at this point in time, when it comes to Metroid Prime 4, hopefully they don't have to go through that. But since we have seen that Metroid Prime 4 was already revealed almost 5 years ago by now, I think I saw a tweet about that most recently, where they mentioned that the game had been revealed almost 5 years ago. I mean, again, the Switch has been out for almost 5 years now, over 5 years, and that game's still not out yet. So it's one of those things where, like, I would hope that they're still not bumping heads at this point in time. You would hope that they've kind of gone over that, or gone, that's no longer the case. But man, I can't imagine being a developer working so hard in the game and then Nintendo just telling you, nope, do it again. I can't imagine how upsetting that must be. But that's about all the information that I wanted to go over. Once again, a huge shout out to the Kiwi Talks podcast for actually interviewing Paul Tazur, a previous retro developer who also gave us all these interesting tidbits. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.